I have told this story only once before, to a fire in a cold room the night after the wedding, with a glass of whiskey I never touched. I am telling it now because I was there for all of it, from the morning in the Edinburgh coffee house, when Alasdair first heard what Baron Renwick had done, to the last moment in the chapel at Cairnhallow when the candles burned so low, the light was the color of old gold, and the woman who had been sold for £300 stood at the altar in her mother's mended lace, and looked at the most feared man in the north of England as though she had always known it would be him. My name is Edmund Holt. I served as steward, confidant, and occasional conscience to Alasdair Calder, the Duke of Cairnhallow, for 11 years before that winter, and I have served in all the same capacities for 13 years since, though the conscience part has grown somewhat easier because he has a better one than he did when we began. I say that as a compliment. He was never a bad man. He was simply a man who had spent his whole life being told that the world arranged itself according to his wishes, which is a deeply corrupting kind of education, and he had survived it largely intact because he happened to also be the kind of man who thought very carefully about what his wishes actually were. Not all men do. The world called him the Northmore Duke. His estate was Cairnhallow, which sat on a ridge above the Tyne Valley in the north of England. He was not Scottish, though the house and the name had a northern stone-and-dice quality that made people think so. He was tall and dark and seldom smiled in public, which had given rise to about 11 different legends about his character, most of them exaggerated. He was not cruel. He was not indifferent. He was not the kind of man who forgot things, which was the quality that people most consistently mistook for coldness. When he looked at you, he was actually looking at you, with real attention and real memory, and many people found this unsettling because they had lived their whole lives in the comfortable blur of not being truly seen. He had earned his reputation for fearsomeness honestly, by standing absolutely still while other men shook, by saying exactly what he meant when every other lord in England said nothing at all, and by remembering with extraordinary precision every debt, financial, moral, and personal, that anyone had ever owed him or anyone under his protection. He would have said, if asked, that this was nothing remarkable. It was simply paying attention. Most people did not. He would have said he rode for Renwick's estate that November morning because a debt had been settled incorrectly. He would have said it in a voice so measured and quiet that a man who did not know him might have believed it. I knew him. I know why he rode. But I am getting ahead of the thing. Let me start where it started, with the girl and with what was done to her. Her name was Isidora Vane. Her father, a minor gentleman of the border country, had spent 11 years accumulating debts that his pride would not allow him to acknowledge, and his intelligence would not allow him to escape. He was, by all accounts I later gathered, a man who had once been genuinely capable. He had managed the family's small estate in his 20s with something approaching competence, and who had then encountered a run of bad seasons, a worse investment, and a belief that the next thing would correct the previous one, which is the belief that ruins more men than any single misfortune ever could. By the time his wife died, 8 years before that November, the estate was mortgaged. By the time his daughter was 23, it was mortgaged twice. When the accounting finally came, as all accountings do, and always worse than expected, the total stood at £340. Not a ruinous sum for a man of real property. For Reginald Vane, who had mortgaged his real property quietly and told no one, it was the end of everything. Baron Renwick held the largest portion of that debt. He was 61 years old, twice widowed, notorious in 3 counties for a temper that had broken 2 stewards, 1 groom, and a cook's spirit in the same winter. He was not an evil man in the specific, deliberate sense. He did not arrange suffering for its own satisfaction. He simply had the very particular confidence of a man who has always had just enough money to make other people's misery convenient to him, and he had never been taught to notice the difference between what he was owed and what he could take. He had a large stone house on a gray valley, a reputation that people respected in the way they respected bad weather, and a household of servants who moved quietly and looked at the floors. When Reginald Vane came to him in October with nothing to offer but apologies, Renwick sat back in his leather chair and looked across the room at Isidora, who had come with her father because there was no one at home to leave her with, and because she had always been the one who went with him to the difficult conversations, on the theory that her presence kept him from promising things he could not deliver. She had not anticipated this particular conversation. She was 23. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and neither of their talent, for pretending that what was happening was not happening. She stood in Renwick's study in a gray wool dress that was perfectly pressed and 3 years out of fashion, and she listened as the Baron outlined the arrangement, her hand in marriage for her father's debt, the papers to be signed within the fortnight, the wedding in November, and she kept her face arranged in the careful neutral she had spent her whole life practicing for exactly this kind of moment, the kind where everything is being decided around you, and you have learned through hard experience. That protest without leverage is just noise. She did not faint, and she did not weep, and she did not say a word until her father had finished stammering his gratitude and the Baron had risen from his chair. She said, "I should like a week to consider it." Renwick looked at her the way a man looks at a dog that has spoken. "Your father has considered it." "My father," she said, still very quietly, "is not the one being offered." There was a silence. Her father's hand found her elbow and pressed, which meant stop. She did not stop, but she also did not continue. She waited, with the stillness of someone who has learned that waiting is its own argument, and let the silence work. Renwick's expression shifted through surprise and arrived at something that was not quite respect, but was at least attention. He was, for all his limitations, intelligent enough to understand that a woman who said that in front of him, with that kind of composure, was not going to be easy to manage, and that a woman who was going to be difficult to manage was best handled with at least the appearance of consideration. He gave her the week. I know all of this because she told me herself, later in the garden at Cairnhallow, when I asked her what she had been thinking in that room. She said she had not been thinking. She had been listening to the sound of the thing being done to her, the way you listen to ice cracking underfoot, trying to judge whether it would hold, and whether running or standing still was more likely to get you to the other side. The week ended, she married him. There was no other option that she could make real. Her father was ill, genuinely ill, by that point. The accumulated strain of the autumn had produced a chest complaint that kept him to his bed and gave her another problem on top of the existing one. The alternative to the Baron was a debtor's court and a family scattered to relations who had made it clear they wanted no part of a vein. She signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in the same gray dress with the same straight back. The wedding was set for the 3rd week of November. It was the 1st week of November when Alasdair heard of it. He heard it from old Mr. Dunmore, a retired solicitor of his acquaintance who handled the affairs of several border families and who mentioned, over coffee in Edinburgh, that the Vane situation had resolved itself rather neatly for Renwick, all things considered, Vane having a daughter of marriageable age and no other assets. Alasdair said nothing. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down with the same care he used for everything. He straightened and asked 2 questions. The first was, how old is the girl? The second was, does she have any family outside the north? She was 23. She had a great aunt in Derbyshire who had not replied to 2 letters. He said, "Thank you, Dunmore." And we left the coffee house, and he said on the street that we would be riding the next morning and would be away some days, and I should see to the horses and whatever else was needed. I should say, for the record, that I had no idea at first why we were riding to Renwick's estate. I knew the direction, south and east, toward the border country, and I knew the pace Alasdair set, which was the particular pace he used when something required settling and delay would make it worse. It was only when I asked, on the 2nd day of riding, whether we had any appointment at our destination, that he told me. "Renwick holds a note from Vane," he said, £340 approximately. I waited. "I am going to retire it," he said, "with a premium for early settlement." "You do not know Vane?" I said. "No," he looked at the road ahead, which was gray and wet and very straight through flat country. "But I knew his wife, Margaret Vane née Elliot. She was my mother's closest friend for nearly 20 years. She died 8 years ago." I did not say anything else. With Alasdair, you learned quickly that the additional thing you were about to say was usually not necessary and was sometimes impertinent, and that the most respectful thing you could offer him in a conversation like this one was the space to have said what he had said, and no more. We arrived at Renwick's estate on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days before the wedding was to take place. It was a cold, low house, gray-stoned and unlovely, set in a treeless valley that seemed designed to collect both wind and misery in equal measure, with a front aspect that faced directly north and seemed to take a grim satisfaction in the fact. The Baron received us in a hall that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool and something less identifiable. The particular smell, I have since come to think, of a household that is adequately maintained but never actually warmed. He was a compact, florid man with the wary look of someone who has spent a long time winning arguments he was not entirely sure he had the right to win, and who has compensated for that uncertainty by winning them more loudly. Alasdair was very pleasant to him. He was always pleasant when he was about to do something irrevocable. I have come to think of this as one of the truest indicators of his intentions. The pleasanter he became, the more certain you could be that he had already decided. He told Renwick he had come to settle Vane's account in full, with a premium for the inconvenience of early retirement of the debt. He named a figure. It was £680, exactly double what was owed. He laid the draft on Renwick's desk with the same gesture you would use to place a book on a shelf, as if it were simply the natural place for it. Renwick looked at the draft, he looked at Alasdair. He looked at the draft again, and his expression cycled through several things in quick succession. Surprise, calculation, the beginning of resentment, the reassessment that comes when resentment runs into arithmetic. The arrangement with Vane's daughter, he said carefully, was agreed. The arrangement with Vane's daughter was a settlement of his financial obligation to you, Alasdair said, and his voice was still entirely pleasant. The obligation is now settled by other means. The engagement, accordingly, is dissolved. I am not certain that is how the law reads. I am quite certain, Alasdair said, and his voice was still so quiet and so pleasant that it took a moment for the temperature of it to register, that you do not want to test it. There was a pause that was very long and very specific. I watched Renwick's face work through several calculations, the sum on the desk, the man standing opposite him, the 30 years of Cairnhallow influence that stood behind that man, the legal cost of a challenge he would almost certainly lose, the question of what precisely he gained by refusing, the answer being nothing except the satisfaction of the refusal, and he was not quite that kind of man, and arrive at an answer that, whatever its other defects, was not stupid. He took the draft. She was in the house somewhere. We had not seen her. Alasdair asked with all the same pleasantness whether Miss Vane might be informed that the situation had changed and that a conveyance was available if she wished to make use of it. Renwick sent a servant, with the air of a man performing an action he has decided to frame as a concession rather than a defeat. She came into the room 10 minutes later. She came in the way she did everything, I later learned, steadily, without haste, and with the kind of stillness in her face that is not absence of feeling but very careful management of it. She wore the same gray dress. She stopped in the doorway and looked at both of us in a way that I can only describe as refusing to be surprised before she was certain there was something to be surprised about. Alasdair said, Miss Vane, I'm Alasdair Calder, I knew your mother. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face, the careful control she had been maintaining over it, the steadiness she had built up over the weeks since her father's study, shifted, just slightly, like a breath released, and then held again at a new equilibrium. She said she spoke of your family. I should like to speak with you if you are willing, he said. Not here. She looked at Renwick. He had the grace to look at his desk. She looked back at Alasdair and said, Give me a moment to collect my things, and went back into the house. She came back in 12 minutes carrying a single bag. It was a small bag, which told me she had not brought much and perhaps had never unpacked, as if some part of her had always intended to be leaving. She said goodbye to no one in the house that I could see. She walked to the carriage with the same straight back and steady pace she appeared to bring to everything, and when Alasdair handed her up, she said, Thank you, and the tone of it was neither effusive nor cold. It was the tone of a woman who meant what she said and did not add ornament to it, and who had decided, I think, in those 12 minutes of collecting her things, that she would not owe him her composure as well as her freedom. We did not speak much on the road north. She sat across from us in the carriage. I had joined Alasdair inside after the first hour, the weather being what it was, and she watched the country pass, the border hills giving way to the longer, harder country of the north, and she occasionally asked practical questions with a directness that I had not expected. Where were we going? To Cairnhallow on the northern edge of the Tyne. What was there? The Duke's estate, the house, the grounds, a household. Was there someone she should send word to? Her father was in the care of a neighbor, and she would write to him as soon as she had an address to give. Did she have any preference, he asked, for where she might eventually wish to be settled? She looked at him then with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite assessment. but somewhere between them, in the place where intelligent people park their feelings when they have not yet decided whether something is funny or merely ironic. "I have just discovered," she said, "that I have very few preferences that anyone has thought worth consulting. I am learning to hold them more lightly." Alasdair did not say anything, but I saw something happen in his face, something careful and brief, like a door opening and immediately being steadied against the wind, and I filed it away with the other things I was beginning to file about this situation. The road north was 3 days. She slept most of the first, which I thought was evidence of either great exhaustion or great self-discipline, and was likely both. On the second day she asked me, while Alasdair was seeing to the horses at a coaching inn, what the Duke was actually like, not the stories, she said, but the facts. She had the look of a woman taking inventory before a journey, assessing what she actually had to work with. I told her he was the most honest man I had ever known, which was not always comfortable, because honesty in its true form tends to make comfortable people uncomfortable, and only becomes comfortable when you have decided you prefer the truth to its alternatives. I told her he had a sense of loyalty that operated more like a geographic feature than a personal trait. It simply existed, like the ridge Cairnhallow sat on, and things arranged themselves around it rather than the other way around. I told her he was not easy, and not warm in the obvious sense, but that I had never once in 11 years seen him be unkind to anyone who had not badly deserved it. She considered this with the careful attention she brought to everything practical, and said it sounded like someone it would be easy to trust and difficult to deserve. I did not know what to say to that. It was too accurate to argue with and too personal to simply agree. So I said nothing, and she seemed to find that a satisfactory answer, and Alasdair came back with the horses, and she did not ask me anything else about him. On the third day it snowed. Not heavily but persistently, the fine dry kind that settles on everything and changes the color of the world to a pale, clean white that makes distances seem both greater and more honest, as if the snow were editing out all the soft edges that obscure things in other seasons. She watched it from the window for a long time without speaking, and the coach moved north through it, and the country became harder and more open. She said, as if continuing a conversation we had not started, "I spent a week trying to think of a way out of it. A real way, not imaginary. There was not one. I want you to understand that I am not a woman who did not try." "I understand that," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and looked back at the snow. Alasdair was holding a book open, but had not turned a page in some time. "Why did he do it?" she said. "Truly, for my mother's memory." "In part," I said. "What else?" I thought about this with the care it deserved. "He does not," I said, "tolerate arrangements that are unjust. It is one of the more expensive things about him." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window, and then she said very quietly, "I hope his accounts are in order." And I heard, for the first time, the faint, dry edge beneath the composure, the particular humor of a person who has been through something extremely unfunny and has come out the other side into a place where the only honest response to the absurdity of the world is to note it. I thought, there she is. Cairnhallow in the snow was something I never tired of, no matter how many times I saw it. It sat on a long ridge above the valley, a great sprawling stone house with a newer wing on the east and a tower on the west that was 300 years old and entirely impractical, and that Alasdair refused to demolish on principle, on the grounds that the people who built it had intended it to stand there, and he was not going to tell them they were wrong from across 3 centuries. The grounds fell away from the house in terraces down to a frozen stream at the bottom, and in winter the whole thing looked like it had grown from the ridge rather than been built on it, as permanent and unconsidered as a rock face, and about as yielding. She said nothing when she saw it, but she straightened slightly in her seat, which I was beginning to understand was her version of a strong feeling. When she was moved by something and did not yet know whether she was entitled to be moved, she straightened. The household received her with the careful courtesy that Alasdair demanded of everyone in his employ, which meant that the housekeeper, Mrs. Garrow, a woman of 45, broad and precise, with strong opinions about proper order and a secret and considerable warmth she expressed through practical action rather than sentiment, showed her to a room that was warm and well appointed, and had a view of the south terrace. Mrs. Garrow told her dinner was at 7, asked whether she required anything, and when she said she would like a desk and some paper, as she needed to write to her father, The desk was there before dinner with 3 kinds of paper and 2 well-cut pens and an inkwell that was freshly filled. She wrote 3 letters that evening. I know this because Mrs. Garrow mentioned it, and because Mrs. Garrow noticed everything that happened in the house and considered it her professional obligation to notice it, and Alastair's professional obligation to hear her account of it. The question of what came next was not immediately answered, and I think all 3 of them, Alastair, Isidora, and myself, who was in the peculiar position of being interested in the answer without being a principal in the question, understood that it would not be answered quickly, and that anything decided too soon would be decided badly. She could not stay indefinitely, not as a guest with no defined role and no defined end, in a house with an unmarried duke. The world being what it was, indefinite situations invited the wrong kinds of definition, and she had had enough of wrong definitions imposed on her to last her some time. She had no money of her own, her father was too ill to receive her, and her great-aunt in Derbyshire remained silent on the subject of letters. She was, in the particular way of women in that world, suspended, freed from one impossible thing and not yet arrived at anything else. She did not appear to experience this suspension with any great anxiety, or at least not with visible anxiety, which in her case might have been the same thing. She borrowed books from the library. Alastair's library was very large and covered an almost offensive range of subjects, from Roman history to estate management to natural philosophy to 3 shelves of botanical illustration that his mother had assembled, and that no one had touched since she died. She read them with what seemed like actual attention, not the performance of reading that people undertake when they are anxious and need something to hold. She walked the grounds in the mornings despite the cold, which Mrs. Garrow found alarming and I found admirable, and which Alastair, when I mentioned it, noted in the particular way he noted things he was going to file and not comment on. She helped in the still-room when the housekeeper permitted it, which was regularly, because she turned out to have a very precise hand and a good memory for quantities and a genuine interest in the work. And Mrs. Garrow, who had strong opinions about many things, had the strongest opinion of all about the value of someone who was actually useful. She did not, in any of this, perform her situation for an audience. She did not perform gratitude or distress or resilience or hope. She simply occupied the days of her life with whatever the days offered, which is a quality that sounds very simple and is in practice very rare. Alastair watched all of this. Not in any obvious way, he was not a man who stared, and he had too much courtesy for that. And he was also a man who understood that a woman who had been looked at as a commodity for 3 months did not need the most powerful man in the house adding his gaze to the inventory. But in the quiet way he had of becoming aware of things without appearing to pursue the awareness, the way that same awareness had made him a formidable estate manager and an equally formidable opponent in any negotiation. He knew when she had been in the library and for how long, and he knew she had asked Mrs. Garrow about the still-room and what she had made there, and he knew the direction she walked in the mornings. Though the grounds were large enough that knowing it required a degree of attention he had not been asked to give. He said nothing about any of this to me. On the 12th day, it was a Wednesday, the 1st of December, and the snow had retreated to frost, and the valley below was pale gold and white in the morning light. I found him in the library in the early evening, standing at the window with a letter he had apparently received and apparently read and was now apparently not reading. The fire was very good. The room smelled of wood smoke and old books, which is one of the better smells in the world. I asked whether everything was all right. He said yes, it was a communication from his cousin's solicitor about a property dispute that was ongoing and tedious. He folded the letter. He said, without looking away from the window, "She has been offered a position." I waited. "A lady of my acquaintance in Northumberland," he said. "A widow. Sensible woman. Needs a companion. Respectable household, reasonable terms." I mentioned carefully that I knew of a suitable woman, and she has offered to meet Isidora at the first opportunity. "You arranged this," I said. I made an introduction. He finally turned from the window. "It is a practical solution. She cannot remain here indefinitely, and she should have something of her own income, a household to be part of, a situation that is hers." "Yes," I said, and then because I knew him and because 11 years had earned me the occasional impertinent question, "Is that what you want, for her to go?" He looked at me with the expression he reserved for questions he found either impertinent or uncomfortably accurate. In this case, I suspected the latter was the larger component. He said, "What I want is that she should have a life of her choosing. That is what I have been attempting to arrange." "And if she chooses to stay here?" "Edmund," the expression shifted to the other register, the quiet, closed register that meant the conversation was being ended. "She has not been asked. She is not in a position to be asked anything. She has nothing of her own. She is dependent on my hospitality. Her reputation is already complicated by the circumstances, and she has been maneuvered into arrangements by men who thought they knew what was best for her for several months already. I am not going to add myself to that list." "That is very principled," I said. "Yes," he picked up a book and sat down with it. "It is." He looked at the page. I looked at him. He turned the page, and I knew from the pace of it that he was not reading. I thought about this conversation for a long time that evening. The thing about Alasdair's code of conduct was that it was entirely real. He was not performing restraint, not waiting politely behind a door he had already decided to open. He genuinely meant it. He had come to Renwick's estate for Margaret Vane's daughter, for the memory of a woman he had known as a child, because the arrangement was wrong and he had the means to make it right. He had not been calculating anything else. The difficulty was that, in the 11 days since the girl had arrived at Cairnhallow, something had shifted in him that I was fairly certain he had not noticed shifting, or had noticed and refused to examine, because examining it would require him to stop being certain that what he was doing was purely the right thing, rather than also the thing he wanted. It was Mrs. Garrow who told me about the library. She mentioned it one morning while we were going over the household accounts together, in the manner of someone reporting a slightly unusual weather event that she felt deserved to be on the record. She said that the Duke and Miss Vane had apparently been in the library at the same time on 3 separate evenings now, and had apparently had quite extended conversations. She knew this because the fire had needed to be made up very late on all 3 occasions, and the housemaid who came to bank it had found them both still there, she in the chair by the south window and he on his feet, which was how he always stood when something interested him deeply enough to forget he had a body. I said that was interesting. Mrs. Garrow said she thought so too, in a tone that communicated she thought it was considerably more than merely interesting, but that she had decided to stop short of editorializing. I asked Alasdair about it only obliquely, as was my usual approach. I said something about the Roman history section, and whether it was in good order, as I had noticed a gap on the shelf. He told me, with a precision I had not actually asked for, that the gap was Tacitus, specifically the Agricola, which she had borrowed because she was interested in the question of whether Agricola's northward campaigns had been strategically sound or merely ambitious, the distinction being important because ambition often masquerades as strategy, and the record for that particular confusion is, historically, very bad. He said this with the air of a man reporting a conversation that he had found, unexpectedly, very good. "You argued about Tacitus," I said. "She has opinions," he said, and the tone of it was both entirely neutral and not neutral at all, the kind of neutral that is built over something that is not. "About Agricola's strategy," I said. "About the difference between courage and recklessness," he said, "which is the real question. She said that the line between them is almost always drawn in retrospect, by people who know the outcome, and that the same decision looks like one or the other depending entirely on whether it worked. She thinks historians are too confident about this." He paused. I disagreed. "And," I said. "And she did not yield," he said, "and I reconsidered 2 of my points." He looked at the shelf with a gap. "She will return it this week." I said reconsidered. "2 of them," he said, which was the most extraordinary thing he had said to me in 11 years. I should say, for the record, that none of this was simple. The world being what it was, a woman in her position, freed from an engagement, resident in a duke's house, unmarried and without family, was in a situation that could be misread very easily and maliciously, and very often was. She knew this. He knew this. They both navigated it with a care that was, in its own way, a form of respect for each other. She did not ask anything of him that could be misconstrued. She did not extend the library evenings beyond the point of propriety. She did not seek him out in the house during the days in any way that would give the wrong impression to anyone who might be paying attention. He arranged nothing that would compromise her further, and he arranged the household so that any meeting between them happened in rooms that were open and visible, and could be accounted for entirely correctly by anyone who might need to account for them. They both appeared to have agreed to all of this without ever discussing it, which was either very sophisticated or very stubborn or both. The letter about the position in Northumberland sat on his desk for 4 days before he gave it to her. She read it carefully, one paragraph at a time, the way she read everything. She sat with it for a moment when she had finished. Then she said, "This is very thoughtfully arranged." "You do not have to accept it," he said. "I know." She folded the letter with neat, deliberate creases. "But I should think about it seriously. Mrs. Ashton sounds like a reasonable woman." "She is," he said. "Sensible, correct. She was kind to my mother, which I thought worth mentioning." She looked at him. "It is a long way from here." "Northumberland is not so very." "From where my father is," she said. "Not from here." He said nothing for a moment, and I could see the calculation moving through him, the question of how much to say, and whether saying it would be another act of arrangement, or whether it was simply information she was entitled to have. He said, "Your father's situation has stabilized somewhat since last month. The neighbor's care is adequate. I have made some arrangements to ensure some continuity of that care." She was very still. "You have been seeing to his care." "The cost is not significant." She put the letter down on the table between them and looked at it, and then at him. And there was a long pause in which several things seemed to be working themselves out in her at once. Her voice, when she spoke, was quite controlled. But underneath the control there was something that had more weight in it than anything I had heard from her before. Not anger, exactly, and not grief, but the thing that lives between them when someone who has been managed without consent recognizes it again. She said, "Alastair, I need you to stop arranging things for me without telling me." He said, "I should have told you." "Yes," she looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything she needed to think clearly about. "I am not ungrateful. I am very far from ungrateful. But I was arranged for by people who thought they knew best for 3 months, and I find I cannot, even when the arrangement is good, even when I would choose it myself if offered the choice, I cannot be managed. Even kindly, it undoes something in me." "That is fair," he said, and then, after a pause that had the quality of real thought in it, "I will tell you when I intend to do something before I do it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very precisely, "And I will ask before I assume." What passed between them in that exchange was something I have thought about a great deal since, because it was not the kind of exchange you see very often between two people who do not know each other well. The directness of it, the equality of it, the fact that neither of them had backed down, and neither had one, and both appeared to understand that this was the correct outcome. Alastair did not explain himself to people as a general rule. He stated, and if questioned, he restated more quietly, and the quiet was the final argument. He did not adjust. He did not say, "That is fair." He was adjusting, and the remarkable thing to me was that it did not appear to cost him anything. It appeared to be the natural consequence of paying actual attention to the person in front of him. The position in Northumberland became the subject of 2 more conversations. She asked about Mrs. Ashdown's household in detail, the size of it, the character of it, what the lady's health was and what her temperament, what the arrangement of a companion's days would look like, and what freedom there was within it. He answered every question with the same completeness he would have brought to any business matter, not because he was trying to persuade her in either direction, but because she had asked, and the questions deserved real answers. I sat through both conversations and thought that I had never watched him have this kind of conversation with anyone, in which the purpose was purely to give the other person enough information to decide well. In the second of those conversations, I stepped out briefly to speak with Mrs. Garrow about something that needed attention, and when I returned the room was quieter. She was standing at the library window with her hands folded in front of her and her back very straight, looking at the frost on the garden. He was at the other end of the room with his hands in his pockets, and his face wearing an expression I could not entirely parse. Not closed, not the careful, pleasant expression he used in negotiations, but something less composed than either. Something that had been said and not been retracted. I asked him that evening what had happened. He said, looking at the fire, "I offered her a choice she had not been given before." "What sort of choice?" "A permanent one," he said, "or the position in Northumberland, both real, both hers." He paused for a long time. "I told her that if she went to Northumberland I would ensure she was well and I would remain at a distance, and that if she did not wish to go, she could remain here, but not as a guest and not as an obligation, as the thing I would like her to be. Another pause. I told her directly she can make of it what she chooses. And she asked for time. 3 days. He looked at the fire without expression. She said she needed 3 days that were entirely her own to make a decision that was entirely her own. I said yes. I thought of her in the still room. I thought of her with Tacitus. I thought of what she had said to me in the carriage. I am learning to hold my preferences more lightly. She will not leave, I said. I don't know that, he said. I do. He did not say anything, but he stopped looking at the fire. The 3 days were very quiet. She walked in the mornings as she always did. She was in the library in the evenings with whatever book she was working through. She helped in the still room on the second day. They were working on a lavender preparation that Mrs. Garrow used for the linen presses, and she stayed an extra hour beyond what was needed, which Mrs. Garrow told me was because she seemed to find the precision of the measurements settling. On the second day, she also asked Mrs. Garrow how long the Duke had been at Cairnhallow, whether he had always lived here, whether this was where he had been a child, what the house had been like when he was young. Mrs. Garrow told her everything, at considerable length and with evident pleasure. She told her about his mother, who had been a woman of strong opinions and a remarkable laugh, and had managed the estate with a kind of calm authority that people remarked on for years after she died. She told her about the tower on the West End, which his father had proposed demolishing 3 times, and which Alasdair had refused to demolish once, at the age of 22, the first major decision he'd made as Duke. She told her about the winter his father died, how he had ridden out alone into the snow and been gone 3 hours and come back with mud on his boots and his face very clean, and how none of the household had known whether to speak to him or not, and how Mrs. Garrow herself had brought him a cup of tea and put it in front of him without comment, and how he had looked at it for a moment and then at her and said simply, "Thank you, Mrs. Garrow." And that had been the beginning of what became 11 years of working well together. Isadora listened to all of this with real attention. She asked questions, precise ones, the kind that show you have been listening and not merely waiting to speak. She asked what he had been like as a boy when he visited. Mrs. Garrow said he had been very serious and very curious and had asked more questions than most adults about how things worked and why they worked that way and what happened when they didn't. She asked what made him laugh. Mrs. Garrow thought for a while and then said, things that were true but that he had not expected to be true. Unexpected truths were, in her observation, the things that most reliably got past his guard. On the 3rd day, she asked to speak with him. I do not know exactly what was said. I know that they were in the study for an hour and a half, and I know that when she came out she looked, the only word I could find was clarified, the way the air looks after a real storm, when all the pressure has resolved and everything is honest again. He came out 15 minutes later, which told me he had stayed behind and required those 15 minutes for something. I have always assumed it was simply standing still in the room for a while, the way he did when something important had happened, and he needed to give it space to be real. He found me in the corridor. He said, without preamble, "Send to my cousin in York about the banns, through Dunmore, quietly." I said yes. He said, "Edmund," he stopped. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment, as if locating something he had misplaced. "Thank you," he said, "for coming with me when I said we were riding for Renwick's." I said, "You didn't tell me why." "I know," he said, "thank you anyway." I had worked for him for 11 years, and he had never thanked me for anything I had not yet done. I took this as a sign that something had changed in him at a level deep enough to alter how he accounted for things, and that the accounting was being done differently now, with more attention to what had actually happened rather than what was still to be managed. The banns were read in January, quietly, with only the necessary people informed and no event made of it. She wrote to her father. He wrote back, in a hand that shook more than it once had, but that still managed to form legible sentences, saying that he was glad. Whether he understood what had happened, the full shape of it, what had been done with his debt and how it had been resolved, I am not entirely sure. She did not tell me what he understood, and I did not ask. The wedding was set for the 1st week of February, in the chapel at Cairnhallow, which was small and old, and had a window on the south side that on clear winter mornings threw light through old colored glass onto old stone in a way that was, without any effort or intention, among the most beautiful things I had seen. Between the banns and the wedding, there were 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, I watched something that I have thought about many times since and still cannot entirely describe, except to say that it was not what I would have expected a love story to look like, if you had asked me before that winter what one looked like. It was not grand gestures. It was not declarations made before audiences. It was very specific and very quiet, and it happened largely in the library, and in the corridors between rooms, and once memorably in the still room where she was doing something with dried herbs, and he had come looking for a document that had been misfiled, and they had both stood in the narrow room for a full minute before anyone moved, because neither of them was quite ready to abandon the proximity. It was two people who had each, in their separate ways and through very different kinds of experience, developed a careful and tested understanding of what could be trusted and what could not, who could be believed, and what words meant, and where the line was between genuine care and management, slowly extending that understanding to include each other and finding that it held. She continued to tell him when she disagreed with him. This happened regularly and on a wide range of subjects. The management of the east quarter of the estate, where she thought the drainage plan he'd approved was going to fail in a wet spring. The question of the tower's structural integrity, which she had assessed with what turned out to be an engineer's daughter's eye. Her mother's family had had building interests in the previous generation, and found less alarming than he'd been told. The Roman history, which they came back to repeatedly. He listened to these disagreements as he listened to everything she said, with his full attention and the genuine willingness to change his position if she gave him sufficient reason. She gave him sufficient reason about the drainage. He thanked her in the practical way, by revising the plan and telling the estate manager why. She was startled by that. She mentioned it to me, not with sentiment but with the careful observation of someone cataloging useful information. She said, "He actually changed the plan." "Yes," I said. "I assumed he would consider it and not change it, and that would be the end." "That is not how he operates," I said. "If you are right, he will tell you and change the plan. If you are wrong, he will tell you why." She thought about this. "In my experience," she said, "those are the same conversation, and at the end of it you are wrong regardless of what you said." "Not with him," I said. She looked out at the garden. The frost was very bright. "No," she said after a moment, "not with him." The still-room morning, I was not there when it happened, but Mrs. Garrow told me, and she had it from the housemaid who had sent him in there to find the misfiled document, resulted in the document remaining misfiled until the following afternoon, which by itself told a complete story. He found the document himself eventually. He did not mention the still-room. Once, it was a Tuesday evening in January, the fire very warm and the outside very dark and cold, and they had been arguing about something to do with the Northumberland border dispute that somehow became an argument about the question of whether principle ever justifies expedience, which is a question with no good answer and a great deal of good conversation in it. She laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, sudden and unguarded and genuine, prompted by something he had said that was more honest than he usually was with anyone, and she looked slightly surprised by it, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting. I went to bed. Her father recovered enough to write several letters in January, all of which she read and put away carefully, with the same lack of visible comment she applied to things she was still deciding how to feel about. He was not well enough to travel to the wedding. She accepted this with the same still face she brought to everything that could not be helped, and she did not speak of it unless asked, and I asked only once in late January. She said, "I am sad he cannot come, but he made the choices he made, and I have made the choices I have made, and I think they are different choices. The difference is what I am most interested in now." I said, "In what way?" "In every way," she said. "He arranged things, he sold things, he decided what was best without asking, and I have actually chosen, with actual choices in front of me, one of which was going and one of which was staying, and both were possible." She paused. "Do you know how rarely both are actually possible? In my experience, it has usually been one possible thing and one theoretical one." "I know," I said. "He had something to do with that," she said. "Alas, dear, not by rescuing me or not only that, by treating the whole situation as solvable." He arrived in Renwick's hall and looked at it and thought, "This is a problem with a solution, and the solution is available." He did not tell me to be resilient. He just fixed it and gave me the space. I said, "I will tell him you said that." "Don't," she said immediately, and then, "Well, you can, but not until after." The morning of the wedding was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that makes the air precise and clean, so that sounds carry further than usual and the light is sharper than you expect, as if the world has decided to be particularly honest on this particular day. She dressed in her mother's lace. She had sent for it from the border house, where it had been in a box for 8 years, and it had arrived by careful post in a cedar chest that smelled of the house it had left. Mrs. Garrow and 2 of the maids helped her with it, and I was told later that she cried a little quietly for a few minutes, and then did not cry any more, not because she forced herself to stop, but because she had said what needed saying, and the rest of the morning was for something else. She came into the chapel on the arm of a cousin of Alastair's, who had traveled from Edinburgh to fill the role that no one closer could fill. She walked down the aisle with the same straight back and steady pace she had walked into Renwick's house with, and into the coaching inn on the road north, and into the library the first time, and out of the still room the morning the documents stayed misfiled. The chapel was lit by candles, because the morning light was good, but the building was old and stone and absorbed the cold, and the candles gave it warmth. The colored glass of the south window threw its light across the altar. She looked at Alastair, who was standing at the altar in gray and silver, and who looked back at her, openly, without the careful management of expression he applied to almost everything else, without the neutrality he had trained himself to maintain in public, with the expression of a man who had not expected to have this, and had not stopped being surprised by it. The chaplain spoke the words that had been spoken in that chapel for 200 years. Outside the snow had begun again, very lightly. When it was done, and she was his, and he was hers, the world recording only one of those facts legally, but both of them being equally real and equally known, he leaned down and said something to her very quietly. I was close enough to see his face when he said it, and the expression on it, but not close enough to hear the words. I asked her later what he had said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the candles on the windowsill, and then she told me. He had said that he intended to spend the rest of his life ensuring that no one arranged anything for her without her knowledge and consent, and that this included him, and that if he ever overstepped, she was to tell him and he would correct it, and that he was sorry for the things that had been done to her before he arrived, and that he would not pretend he could undo them, but that he could be, if she would let him, a different kind of fixed point. Something she could rely on that was also hers to redirect when it went in the wrong direction. She said she had told him that she would allow it, but that he should know she was a difficult woman and she would hold him to every word of that, and that he had probably underestimated what allowing her to redirect him actually involved. He had said, apparently, that he was counting on it. I have worked for him for 11 years and for 24 years since, and I have never seen him look at anything the way he looked at her in that chapel. Not at the estate, not at the title, not at the things he had built, the things he had defended, the positions he had held. He looked at her the way he looked at the things he had decided to keep, with the absolute and unembarrassed certainty of a man who has thought it through completely and arrived at a conclusion from which he will not be moved. She told me once in the garden at Cairnhallow, years later, that what she had thought about during the 3 days was not whether she trusted him. That, she said, had been settled fairly early, which had surprised her, because she did not trust quickly and had particular reason not to trust powerful men who arranged things. What she had thought about, in those 3 days, was whether she trusted herself. Whether the thing she felt when she was in the library with him, or in the same room, or thinking about the same question from opposite angles, and arriving at different answers, and discovering that the discussion of the difference was more interesting than the answer. Whether that thing was real, or whether it was the particular confusion of a person who has been in the cold for a long time and has mistaken warmth for love. She had decided, and she was very precise about how she had arrived at the decision, that it was not gratitude. Gratitude would have faded when the immediate situation resolved. It is the nature of gratitude to reduce as the thing that prompted it recedes. What she felt had not faded. It had sharpened. It had sharpened specifically in proportion to the degree to which he had treated her as a person with a mind and a will of her own, which is not how gratitude works, and which was the evidence she trusted most. I think she was right. I think she was right about almost everything, which is a quality she shared with him, and which explained a very great deal about why they suited each other with the completeness that they did, not the smooth, frictionless fit of 2 people who have sanded down their edges. but the fitted, solid fit of two pieces that were always meant to work against each other and have found the right joint. I have told this story now because I think it is worth telling, and because I am old enough now that the things worth telling feel more urgent. Not for the romance of it, though there is real romance in it. Not for the rescue, though there was a real rescue. I have told it because of what happened in between. The 3 days she took entirely for herself. The library and the frost and the still room and the misfiled document and the Roman historians. The conversation where she told him she could not be managed, and he said that was fair. The way two people who had both learned the precise cost of choosing badly built something very carefully, very slowly, with their eyes open, and chose it anyway. The snow had stopped by the time we came out of the chapel. The terrace was white and the valley below was white, and the sky was the pale, clear blue that comes after a storm when everything has been resolved and nothing is left suspended. She stood on the terrace steps and looked at it, and then she looked at him and he looked at her. The Duke of Cairnhallow took his wife's hand. She let him, which was the right word for it, not a passive thing, not something that happened to her, but a deliberate act of letting, of choosing again in this small, specific moment the thing she had already chosen in the study 3 weeks before. The valley below was white, and the sky was blue, and the old tower on the west end of the house stood in the winter light exactly as it had always stood, impractical and unreasonable, and refusing to come down, and not going anywhere. Neither were they. I want to say something more about the library, because I think people who were not there will assume they know what it was, and they will be wrong. They will picture two people sitting decorously on opposite sides of a fireplace, exchanging careful opinions in careful voices, the whole thing wrapped in the particular cotton wool of restrained feeling. And none of that is wrong exactly, but none of it captures the quality of the thing. What I observed, across the evenings Mrs. Garrow reported, and the one I witnessed directly, was something more like two very different instruments playing the same piece of music and discovering, partway through, that they were not playing separate parts but a single composition that had always assumed both of them. The subjects were wide. They moved from the Romans to the question of whether the north wing's roof should be rettled now or in the spring. She had looked at the pitch of it from the garden and thought it could wait. He had been advised it should not. She explained her reasoning in structural terms that were more precise than anything the estate's usual man had given him, and he listened, and then said he would look at it himself. They moved from the roof to the question of what a person owes to the people they cannot help disappointing, which was a philosophical question with obvious practical origins in both of their situations. They moved from that to the matter of what Isidora had wanted, as a girl, before it became clear that what she wanted was not the primary organizing principle of her life. I was present for this last conversation, which surprised me, as it was more personal than anything she had said in my hearing, and I think she allowed it because I had been part of the story from the beginning, and she had decided, in her accountant's way of deciding things, that I was safe to have in the room when real things were said. She said she had wanted to know how buildings worked. Not as a profession, she had understood even as a girl that this was not available to her as a profession, but as a fact. How walls held themselves up, why arches worked, what made the difference between a roof that lasted and one that did not. Her mother's family had built things, and she had grown up with men at the table who talked about load and span and material, and she had found it, she said, the most satisfying vocabulary she had ever encountered because it was entirely honest. A wall held or it did not. An arch bore weight or it did not. There was no room in it for pretending. Alasdair said, "And what happened to that interest?" She said, "The same thing that happened to all the other interests. It became a thing I knew about quietly, without being able to do anything with it." There was a pause. He said, "The East Drainage Plan, you were right about it." She looked at him. He said, "When you told me what you thought was wrong with it, the runoff problem in wet ground, I checked it against the original survey." "You were right, I revised it." She said, "I know. You told the estate manager I had said it." "Yes," he said, "because you said it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the fire. After a while she said, "That is not something I have experienced before." Someone saying where the thought came from, when the thought came from me. He said, "I find it is usually accurate to say where a thing comes from." She said, "Most men do not think so." He said, "Most men are wrong about a great deal." She looked at the fire for another moment, and then she said very quietly, "When I was 17, I told my father's architect that the kitchen addition would flood at the west corner because the grade ran wrong, and he told me very patiently that foundations did not work that way and that I should leave it to the people who understood it. 3 years later, the kitchen corner flooded. My father had it repaired and never mentioned it again. She paused. That is the only time in my life I have been right about a building and seen it confirmed, which is a very small number for a person who has been right about buildings many times. He said, "You will have considerably more opportunities here if you stay." She did not say anything, but the stillness she settled into then was a different kind of stillness from the careful, controlled kind she used to manage difficult conversations. It was quieter and more still, and had something in it that I thought was very close to relief. I excused myself shortly after and went to my rooms, and I did not ask either of them what else was said that evening. There is one more thing I want to say about the 6 weeks before the wedding, and it is this: he was afraid. Not obviously, not in any way that he would have admitted to, not in any way that he would have been comfortable having named. But I had worked for him for 11 years, and I knew what his fear looked like, which was exactly like his calm. The same stillness, the same measured voice, the same economy of movement, except that it happened in the presence of things he could not control through his usual method of being more prepared than anyone else in the room. What he could not control was what she would choose. He had made his offer, and he had given her the 3 days, and he had not asked her anything in the interim, which was itself an act of such deliberate restraint that it must have cost him considerably, because his instinct, in any situation that mattered, was to do something, to act, to arrange, to ensure. He had done nothing for 3 days. He had been in the library in the evenings, with books, and had apparently been reading them with actual attention, which I know because I looked at the books afterward, and they were at different places than they had been. On the second of the 3 days, I asked him how he was. He said he was well in the tone that meant he knew what I was actually asking and was choosing to answer the surface version of the question. I said, "She will not leave." He said, "I know you believe that." I said, "I know her now." He said, "So do I, which is why I am not certain." And I understood then. He was afraid precisely because he knew her well enough to know that she was genuinely deciding, genuinely considering the alternative, and that the genuine consideration was the only kind worth having. He would not have wanted her to choose this because she had nowhere else to go. He would only have wanted her to choose it because she chose it, and the choosing was real and free and entirely hers. When she came to him on the 3rd day, I was in the corridor outside the study, not because I was listening, but because the corridor was where I worked in the mornings and I happened to be there. I heard neither voice raised. I heard at one point a long silence that lasted several minutes. Then I heard her say something I could not make out, and him say, clearly, "Yes." And then nothing for a while, and then the door opened and she came out. And as I said, she looked clarified, like something that had been cloudy and had resolved. I stepped aside to let her pass. She stopped and looked at me, and she said, "I have decided to be very difficult about the tower. I think it is beautiful, and I think there are structural reasons to keep it, and I intend to make a thorough case." I said, "He will be glad of the argument." She said, "Good," and walked on, and there was something in the walk, still the same straight back, still the same steady pace, but lighter than it had been. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that the things it had been carrying were now being carried differently, more evenly distributed, with someone else also bearing some of the weight. I stayed for the wedding and for the week after it, and then I went south to see to some business and came back in the spring. I came back to a household that was, to the eye, much the same as it had always been, the same stone house, the same grounds, the same tower on the west end that was never going to come down. Mrs. Garrow was the same. The kitchen was the same. The east drainage had been revised. The library was different in a way that I noticed before I could name it. It was twice as inhabited. 2 chairs at the south window instead of 1. 2 stacks of books, with no very clear organizing principle between them except use. A map of the estate spread on the long table with notes in 2 different hands, his, which was small and exact, and hers, which was somewhat larger and equally exact, and had made 3 additions to his drainage notation with a different colored ink. I found her in the garden, which she was also in the process of reorganizing, on structural principles. She had a scheme for the north terrace that would improve the drainage there as well and incidentally make the winter garden visible from the tower, which she had decided deserved a good view. I asked how the tower had been adjudicated. She said the structural case had been made and accepted, and that there were now also plans for the interior, which had been largely unusable for 60 years, to be made useful again. She said this with a satisfaction that was entirely practical and also not, in the least, purely practical. I said, and the Duke. She considered the North Terrace. She said, he as well. He is arguing with the solicitor from York about the property boundary, and he is winning, and it is improving his character considerably, because arguing with people he is going to beat is the one thing that makes him modest. She paused. He told me last week that I was right about the kitchen roof angle as well. The east slope. He had looked at it again. And I told him I expected to be consulted about the west wing before any plan was finalized. She looked at the terrace with the comfortable expression of someone whose territory is clearly understood. He agreed. This is the story. This is what happened in the order it happened with the people it happened to. A debt was settled. A woman was freed from an arrangement that was unjust. A man who had built his entire life on the principle of attending carefully to what was actually true attended carefully to what was actually true, and found that the truth was this, that a woman who had been wronged was not diminished by it, that someone who had been arranged for could choose freely when choice was genuinely offered, and that the thing he had thought he was doing out of principle and the thing he had wanted, somewhere below the principle, had turned out to be the same thing. She had found a fixed point. He had found, which I think surprised him more, that a fixed point is considerably more stable when something is pulling against it, that the resistance clarifies the thing, the way the cold clarifies the air, so that you can see further than you could before. I am old now. The fire is good, and the whiskey is better than it was that night after the wedding when I did not drink it. I am drinking it now. To Isidora, who was not diminished, to Alasdair, who paid attention, to the tower which is still standing. One more thing, which I should have said earlier but which belongs here at the end, where the proportions are right. In the spring after the wedding, it was March, the ground still hard but the light beginning to shift. I was in the east corridor one afternoon, and I passed the door of the small study that had been given over to her use, and the door was open, and she was at the desk with papers spread in front of her, and Alasdair was standing at the window looking out at the garden where the first green things were showing, and neither of them was saying anything. They were simply in the same room, in the same silence, with the particular quality of silence that exists between people who are together, because they want to be rather than because there is nowhere else to go. I did not stop, I kept walking. But I thought about it for a long time afterward, that silence, and the specific quality of it, which was the opposite of the silences I had seen her navigate in her father's house, in Renwick's study, in the carriage on the road north. Those had been the silences of a woman in held breath, waiting for the shape of the thing that was being done to her to become clear. This was a silence of another kind entirely, the silence of a person who has arrived somewhere and is not listening for the sound of what comes next, because what comes next is already here. I could not have told you, the morning we rode from Edinburgh, that this was where we were going. I could not have told you, even at the gates of Renwick's house, that the woman with the single bag would look, 8 months later, like someone who had always known the answer to a question she had only recently been permitted to ask. But that is how it is with the things that matter. They look inevitable afterward, and contingent before. And the line between the two is just the moment when someone pays enough attention to act on what they see. He paid attention. She allowed it on her own terms in her own time, and the tower is still standing.